Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lexi Bond. I'm the Professional Development and Training Coordinator here at the Department of Education. We have our special diets virtual training today. And before we get started, if you are new to our virtual trainings, you will notice that this training is being recorded, so everyone's camera and microphone is turned off. If you do have a question throughout the training, the chat feature is open. Feel free to drop your questions in there. However, we will be opening up the floor for questions at the end. If you'd like to come off mute, just raise your hand using the feature at the top of your screen, and someone will enable your microphone. Following the training, you will receive an email with a copy of this presentation, links to the recording, and the survey code, which will generate a certificate with your professional development hours and information. So thanks again for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our East Regional Nutrition Consultant, Frankie Norton.
Thanks, Lexi. Hello, everyone. As Lexi mentioned, I'm Frankie Norton. I am the East Region School Nutrition Consultant. And I just want to start off by saying thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to come and learn with us today. We're going to learn about special diets, or as you see on the screen, accommodating children with disabilities in school nutrition programs. So before we get started, of course, now Lexi, my PowerPoint is not responding, so let's give it just a moment. I don't know what it doesn't like. It's Murphy's Law.
Of course.
Yeah,
Is
I
it
went to
not
go
letting
click.
you?
No, it's grayed the screen and it says PowerPoint is not responding. So
Oh,
I'm going to
no.
wait for it to respond for just a moment and see if whatever it was unhappy about, it can get over.
That sounds good. If we need to exit and reshare your screen, we can do that as well.
Yeah, it's still thinking. I might do that. So bear with me, everyone. Sorry, technical difficulties. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see if I can get this to unbe angry with itself. That. Start from the beginning and share my screen again. All right, I think it's back, Lexi. Do you see it?
It looks great to me.
Let's see if we can move. Oh, we can. Okay.
Awesome.
All right, little
job.
hiccup. Is there anything on that screen that you all can see? Because I have a little pop-up over there. Is there anything blocking your view?
It looks wonderful. Nothing's
Great.
blocking.
Okay. All right. So, oh my goodness, it is freezing again. I don't know what is not happy about. We practice this.
Hey,
I'm
that's
so
okay. It's
sorry.
just bound to happen sometimes. If we have any more issues, I can share it on mine and we can go from there. We'll just give it a minute.
Let's try this one more time. Let me close that out. Maybe if I just really restart this PowerPoint presentation, perhaps that will work. Okay, start again. 1, 2. Here we go.
It looks good to me so far.
Okay, let's try it. All right, so this is the disclaimer for the generative AI tools. As you know, the state of Tennessee does not permit the use of any generative AI tools such as Otter or any of those other apps in meetings that are hosted on state resources. So if you are using an AI tool to transcribe or record the presentation, you'll be asked to leave the meeting and we'll have that app blocked. And the reason for that is because these apps are not secure or adequately regulated. Any state data being shared during the presentation could be misrepresented and protected data could be accidentally released to the public. So we ask for your respect for our decision to safeguard information. And for meeting notes, please rely only on the materials provided by us, TDOE, such as approved recordings and supplemental resources. And just as a quick reminder, a recording of this training is going to be available, as will the slide deck, in the future in the Teach All platform. So this slide is familiar. Our mission statement in school nutrition is to develop extraordinary school nutrition professionals and provide strategies to increase consumption of healthy school meals. So the agenda for today, we're going to define a disability. We're going to learn what procedural safeguards are. We're going to identify what information is needed to accommodate a child's disability or impairment. And we're going to distinguish between a disability and accommodations for food preferences. So what is considered a disability? That's a big question we get. Well, according to the American with Disabilities Act, the term disability means a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of an individual. It also means a record of having such an impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. And under the American with Disabilities Act amendment, most physical and mental impairments constitute a disability. So this includes bodily functions such as digestive, bowel, and endocrine systems. So a disability of any physical or mental impairment that restricts a child's diet must be reasonably accommodated. So you can tell, so, that's something that has recently been expanded. I know it says 2008, but it's something that we forget, that really this concept of a disability when it comes to meal modification includes those bodily functions. That's really an important thing to remember. So, especially if you're in my region and you've ever called me about a special diet question, you've heard me ask you or mention procedural safeguards. So we're going to talk about those next. So what are procedural safeguards? What they are they're things that are included in the district's meal modification procedure that tell parents or guardians about the district's process for requesting meal modifications and also how to resolve grievances related to those requests. So it's important that a parent feels safe in disagreeing with decisions made about meal modifications and that they know how they can request changes be made for their child. So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to say that procedural safeguards must inform parents of the right to resolve grievances related to the meal modification request. It must also, your procedural safeguards must also tell parents about their right to request and participate in impartial hearings to help resolve their grievances. It must tell parents that they can be represented by counsel at the hearing and they have the right to examine the record. The grievance process must provide a prompt and equitable resolution, notice of the final decision, and the right to appeal the decision. And really, there should already be a grievance system in place at the district that is acceptable. So you might want to check with your district before trying to develop one from scratch, because they probably already have a grievance resolution system in place that can be utilized. Another part of meal modifications and procedural safeguards is the request process. So ideally, when developing the process for submitting meal modification requests, the LEA would include the 504 coordinator, the nutrition supervisor, the school nurse, and any other relevant district personnel. This helps ensure everyone's on the same page. And you need to do this when you're developing the procedure so that really all of these people who are important to this meal modification process really have a seat at the table, but then also they're not surprised when later on, when the requests come in, that you're asking for specific information. Also, when you're thinking about developing this meal modification request procedure, you might want to consider including in your timeline, in your policy, a timeline that helps protect both the SFA and the students. So you want to tell parents that here's the documentation you need to submit for us to do this meal modification. And by the way, if when you submit the documentation, if you don't give us everything we need, we'll do some temporary modifications for X amount of time while you're gathering the remaining documentation or getting the clarification. But you want to put a timeline or a time frame in there for which if they don't come back with what you need, that you will stop accommodations. And you need to have that in there on the front end so that you have a way to stop accommodations if parents just refuse to try to get you the documentation that you need. So that really protects you, the student you want to accommodate, but you also want to protect yourself as a district by giving yourself a way to stop a temporary accommodation. So it's important to get that in this procedure on the front end. That way you're not trying to deal with it on the back end when you have maybe some requests that aren't parents aren't really paying attention to and helping you get what you need. We also recommend a team approach to meal modifications. This is kind of alludes to what was on the prior slide. A team approach means involving all relevant parties and making sure that they're at the table when decisions about meal modifications are being made. So, really, a team approach should involve maybe your 504 coordinator, other people from the district, maybe a principal or school administrator. It should certainly involve the school nutrition supervisor, the cafeteria manager, perhaps, a school nurse, and of course, parents or guardians. Oftentimes, you're given a piece of paper and you're trying to interpret it without ever calling the parent. And I think it's really important to kind of get everybody at the table, especially for the complex ones, so that everybody understands what that piece of paper means and how you can safely accommodate a child. So this slide and the following slide is something from the Michigan Department of Education. They've kind of laid out some step-by-step guidelines on how to develop procedural safeguard or what should be included. And their first thing is you want to develop your procedures. You want to tell parents how they can get the meal modification, how they submit the documentation, what's the required documentation, what is determining a reasonable modification. You want to let them know of their rights for resolving grievances and complaints. You want to train your staff, all relevant staff on this, on all special diets procedures. You want to talk to them about legality and confidentiality. Then you want to assign some key personnel. You want to designate team members at each school and throughout the district who are part of this process. So that it's handled fairly and equitably across the district. You don't want one school handling it one way and another school handling it different. Again, you want to use that team approach. You want to get everybody involved and at the table so that you can safely manage these meal modifications in a fair way that is best for the child. So now we're going to move on to food allergies. So, what are food allergies? Well, really, there's no formal definition for them. However, the USDA policy memo SP 40 2017 does describe a food allergy as an immune system reaction to a component of food, at times producing life threatening responses. And then policy memo SP 26 2017 goes on to clarify that a food allergy will generally be considered a disability. There are nine common food allergies. Sesame was recently added to the list. There was 8 before. So you might even have in your kitchens a list of the 8 common food allergies. You want to amend that and go find some of the most current posters that are out there, probably available at ICN in different areas, to update those to show the 9 common food allergies. That doesn't mean that students don't have more allergies than what is listed here. These are just the most common ones. So there's some best practices around food allergies, and these are just a few. These are some of the thoughts that we had. You want to ensure that your children's allergy list is current, up to date, accurate, that you have all of the documentation you need. You want to provide continuing specialized training for staff members who work to prepare food or help manage children with allergies. It's very important that they understand exactly how to do that safely. You want to make sure that your staff know how to check food labels for allergens for all of the products provided to students with food allergies, and that can be tricky. If you're not a dietitian, and I am not, full disclosure, when I'm reading food labels, it's very confusing and it's very hard to know. So you might need to recruit the help of a dietitian or somebody else who has specialized knowledge to be able to read these food labels to keep these children safe. You want to ensure proper storage and preparation of foods to prevent cross contact and exposure to food allergens. You also want to ensure that food preparation equipment, serving materials, and surfaces are cleaned and sanitized properly. If you look in the HACCP SOP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Plan, your food safety plan, there's actually an SOP for that on how to prevent cross contamination. So that might be a good thing to pull out and review with your staff on a regular basis. So now we'll move on to medical statements. So when is a medical statement required? So anytime if you get a request for a meal modification, if the meal pattern must be altered in order to meet the modification, then it's going to require a medical statement. And an example of that would be if you get a statement that says, or you get information from a note from a parent or a teacher that says, hey, this child can no longer have milk, provide them water instead. Well, you can't do that without a medical statement. You have to have something from a prescriptive authority that outlines all of the requirements. And we'll go into the requirements of a medical statement here in a moment. However, if the needs of a child could be met without altering the meal pattern, then you don't necessarily have to have a medical statement. So, for example, if a child is allergic to strawberries and you get a note from the parent or a teacher that says, hey, Charlie Brown is allergic to strawberries, don't give him strawberries anymore. Well, that's pretty easy to accommodate. You don't just eliminate the fruit component, right? You just give Charlie Brown a different fruit. You could give him a banana or anything that isn't a strawberry. In that case, you don't necessarily need a medical statement unless your district has decided in their meal modification procedure that we just talked about developing that you're going to require medical statements for all meal modifications. That's up to you all to do that. If you want to, you can. There are benefits of doing that. If you want to require a medical statement for any meal modification, it might help prevent preferences from being treated as, allergies or disabilities. So that's kind of food for thought, but you need to be consistent and it needs to be written in your procedure if you're going to require medical statements for all meal modifications. That's a choice you can make. But if you're going to do it, then you need to do it and write it down and say you're going to do it. So when a medical statement is required, what must be included in the medical statement? That's a really good question. So it would need to include information related to the disability or the impairment of the child, explaining why the accommodation is necessary. It's going to need to explain how to accommodate the disability and what foods to be omitted and what foods to be substituted. So in the case of the strawberry allergy, it would need to say, please omit strawberries. And then it would also need to say, serve any other fruit that's not a strawberry. It sounds silly, but it's really important to get that other piece. And I know that sometimes is difficult to do to get that what else to substitute. So you just have to kind of work with the household to get what you need, get a complete medical statement. So medical statements must come from medical professionals with prescriptive authority. And this is a list of those in Tennessee who have prescriptive authority. So you can accept a medical statement signed by one of these, a person with this authority. And you'll notice that at the bottom, registered dietitians and registered dietitian nutritionists are now on the list when they were not before. And the reason for that is because the recent final rule for has included something for meal modifications that says it's expanded the authority to register dietitians, and that actually begins July 1st, 2025. You could have started accepting them back on July 1st, 2024, but it is required on July 1st, 2025 that you do accept that if you get one from a registered dietitian. And I think that's helpful because I think in many cases, when you get some of these very complex meal modification statements, I think registered dietitians will probably do a much better job of helping you understand the substitutions and the ingredients than maybe just the regular doctor's office visit might. So that might actually be helpful for you all moving forward. So we do have, as a state agency, we have an example of a meal modification form on our website, and your consultant can send it to you. There's a little snippet of it on the screen right now. And what I would say is that the snippet shows that there is a TDOE logo at the top, and you can see the word sample kind of as a watermark in the background. This form is not intended for you to download and distribute to parents as is. It's really intended as a guide. What we want you to do is to take the language off this form. If you don't already have one that meets the requirements, you can take the language from our form and put it on your district letterhead and make it your own, right? So it doesn't need to say TDOE because we're not authorized to give you a request for meal modifications. Your district has to develop that and make that their own thing. So if you can't find that on our website, it is linked in this PowerPoint. So when you get the slide deck, you'll have the link, or you can always just reach out to your regional consultant. They'd be happy to send that to you. All right, so what happens if you get a statement, a medical statement, and it's not clear? So that happens, unfortunately, more frequently than not. So what you need to do is you need to use as much of the statement as possible that is clear to provide as much of the accommodation as possible, while simultaneously reaching out immediately to contact the parent or guardian to ask for clarification or additional guidance. We do not recommend that you, the SFA, contact the medical provider directly. That's not your role. Your role is to work with a parent, and it is the parent's responsibility to work with their medical provider. So just remember, do not delay in making accommodations. You need to make as much of the accommodation as possible. And then going back to our procedural safeguards, if your procedure on the front end says, hey, parent, if we don't get what we need, we'll accommodate for X amount of time while you work with your medical professional. But then after X amount of time, if you've not given us what we need or you're not working with us, we're going to stop the accommodation. Remember, if you have that in your procedure on the front end, it's going to help you in this situation when the medical statement isn't clear and you're trying to accommodate the child as best as you can, but you need more guidance or you need an amended medical statement. You've got to give yourself a way out of these temporary accommodations, and the way to do that is through your procedural safeguards. So, meal modifications and reasonable accommodations. Let's talk about that. What is a reasonable accommodation? Well, that's a really good question, and it really just depends. So, whenever you make meal modifications for students with disabilities, you need to be sure the accommodation that you're making is reasonable. So, an accommodation is a change in or alteration in a policy, a practice, a procedure to ensure that children with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in a benefit or a program. So the request for a modification must relate directly to a child's disabling condition, and it must be made on a case-by-case basis. There's no blanket accommodation that can be made, right? You have to look at every child's need and make an accommodation reasonably based on their need. The goal is to ensure that every child is included and that no one feels excluded or singled out because of a disability. So, for example, a request to provide a specific brand name item would not necessarily be reasonable if a nutritionally equivalent item is already available from your food bid. So, a nutritionally equivalent is really the key there, right? So, it could be that a specific brand name is the only brand that provides whatever the accommodation is. It's possible, not likely, but it's possible. However, providing foods to meet the need of a child with, say, PKU that requires special food items, that is reasonable. So it really just depends on what the accommodation that you're being asked to do is, whether it's reasonable or not. What is the nutrition requirement, and do you have something that can make that requirement without necessarily going to buy a brand item somewhere off bid? You just have to look at it on a case by case basis. And again, if you're not sure, if you need help, you can always reach out to your consultant and they can help you kind of work through that process. So, how do you pay for these meal modifications? Well, the cost cannot be charged to the student or the parent. So, just because a child has a disability and they need special food or special accommodations, you cannot pass that along to the parent. But funds can be used from the LEA's general fund to pay for some things. The food service fund can pay for these items. And in some cases, the special education fund can be used if the child has a 504 or an IEP. So what about services what if you're asked to provide services that are outside of our USDA programs, our National School Lunch and Breakfast Program? Well, SFAs are not required to provide meal services, special foods, or supplements to children with disabilities when the meal service is not normally available to all children. If an IEP or a 504 includes special foods or supplements outside the normal meal periods, the LEA, the local education agency administration, is responsible for providing these and allocating the cost to make these accommodations. So if you're asked to provide snacks to a child outside of your meal service because it's in their 504 plan, then that's really the responsibility of the LEA to provide and allocate those funds to do so. The IDEA has funds to cover the needs of some higher cost items according to regulations. And also keep in mind the LEA could indicate in the 504 that the school nutrition program would be responsible for this service, but ultimately it's up to the LEA to make that decision and make those allocations. So now we're going to talk about the difference between a medical request versus a preference. So food preferences are optional, but if provided, they must meet the USDA meal pattern. Examples of food preferences are like general health conditions, not disability, something that rises to a disability, right? Personal preferences, vegetarianism, religious or moral convictions. So, what you might run across is some parents want their children to have gluten-free meals because they believe gluten-free is just healthier, not because the child has an impairment or a disability. In that case, you don't have to provide a gluten-free meal. But if you do choose to provide gluten-free meals on preferences for a non-disability request, you must provide it for all other students whose parents or whose students want to choose a gluten-free meal. So remember, if it's not a disability, if it's a food preference, if you do it for one, you have to do it for all. So now we're going to kind of go through some of these questions that we get often. So one is, and this is a common mistake that is made, can a child's food or meal accommodation be accommodated through offer versus serve? And the answer is no. Um, you cannot ask a child to just not decline a component simply because they have a food disability or I mean a food allergy. So you can't ask them to exclude that component. If they have a medical statement that indicates they have digestive issues with fluid milk, but the statement does not specify what to substitute, you're going to need clarification. If the parent states the child drinks juice at home instead of milk, the medical statement will need to be amended with instructions to provide juice in place of milk. And then with that statement on file, the meal would be considered complete, even though you were only offering four components. So thinking about offer versus serve, at lunch you have to have all five components. You can't just say, we're just not going to give you milk. Now, if the doctor says on a medical statement, okay, this child's never going to get milk, you're going to give them juice, then that's fine. You can do that. But it's not the same as the strawberry situation. If a child's allergic to strawberries, you can offer them a different fruit. They're still getting the same fruit. They're getting a fruit component. It's just a different fruit within the component. So you can't use offer versus serve to make meal accommodations. Another question we get asked is what happens if the child no longer needs a meal modification? What if the parent calls up, the school cafeteria and says, "Hey, I know Charlie Brown had this allergy to milk, fluid milk last year, but this year it's not an issue. We want you to give him fluid milk." Well, your manager doesn't need to do that on their own. That's why your procedure needs to really direct how all information regarding meal modifications needs to flow. You need to make that decision ahead of time because FNS doesn't require like a signature or something from the doctor to pull that back, to pull that meal modification back. But they do recommend, and I think it's a very good idea, to get something in writing from the parent, not just to do it on a verbal request. Because remember, if there's nothing to document something, it didn't happen, right? So if a parent just calls your manager and the manager discontinues the accommodation this week, and then next week the other parent calls up and says, "Why are you giving my child milk?" And you don't have a signed piece of paper, something from a parent or an email that says, "Hey, we told you to stop," then you're going to look like you're out of compliance. You're going to look like you stopped a modification for no reason. So Even though FNS doesn't require something in writing, they highly recommend you do at least get something from the parent before you stop an accommodation. Another question we get is what about having a separate table for children with special dietary needs? In short, those we call those allergy safe spaces. They can be used, but they must not be forced on a child. And as a director, you really can't guarantee that an allergen won't appear at that table. So please be careful. Please be careful when designating allergy-free spaces if you do so. You've always got to make the decisions based on what's best to meet a child's need, and that really has to be done on a case-by-case basis. So if you have these allergy-free spaces, you can't force a child to sit there, and you must also allow their friends to come sit with them if they're going to have a meal that is allergy-free for that student. So again, I recommend that team approach, working with everybody, including the parent, to figure out what is the best seating arrangement for their child. Do they need an allergy-safe space? And then how are you all going to accommodate that? And is the parent on board with them sitting in a separate location?
Frankie, you do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Um, it says, what about religious preferences or accommodations? They had a nurse recently ask about a religious exemption.
So that would just be a preference. It's not a, it's the same as vegetarianism or just a request for gluten-free when there's no medical reason for it. There's no disability to go with that. So if you're going to accommodate the religious preference, you have to accommodate it for everybody who wants it. And the meal pattern has to meet the requirements. So there's no exception to not serve a, necessarily a meat or meat alternate. You couldn't just exclude that. If you're going to do a preference for religious purposes, the meal still has to be reimbursable by the rules. So I hope that answers it. If not, send something follow up in the chat. That's a good question. So, what role does an IEP or individualized education program play in meal modifications? So, an IEP should work in conjunction with meal modifications. If there is a meal modification stated in the child's individual education program, then all information, the IEP would have to have all information in the medical statement. So, if a written medical verification is obtained during the IEP process, you don't have to necessarily go back and get something different. You just have to make sure it contains all the required elements. And meal modification requests should be part of the team approach. So whoever the IEP providers are should be aware of the meal modification process that the school that the district has developed, right? So again, team approach, everybody on the same page. You don't have to ask parents to duplicate their medical statement efforts as long as the medical statement meets the school nutrition department's needs, the requirements for our program. So gluten-free diets, what about them? So a lot of people are really into gluten-free. You have to work with the parent or guardian to have a clear understanding of the severity of the disability and the child's needs. Again, you don't have to accommodate gluten-free if it's just a preference, if it's just a lifestyle the parent wants. Again, same thing with that religious thing. But if it is a disability, you do really need to make sure you accommodate this because it can be severe. So you're going to want to review the ingredient labels of all your products to look for hidden gluten sources, and we're going to cover some of those in a minute. I recommend working with your distributors, your vendors. Again, if you've got a good registered dietitian on staff or a friend, they can be a great source of information. We've got several on staff that can help you out if you're stuck and don't understand, how to read a label. We can help you with that. The thing about gluten is it's kind of sneaky, right? It's commonly used in processed products. I mean, it is in wheat, barley, rye, and their derivatives and those different types of wheat, the varieties that are listed on the screen. But the thing about gluten is it can also be found as a thickening agent in things like gravies and puddings. It's used for texture in deli meats and meat patties, and it's used to prevent caking in a lot of seasoning mixes. So you look at a bottle of, seasoning mix and you think, oh, there's no gluten in this. Well, there very well could be. So how do you know if there's gluten in something? You've got to read labels. You've got to look for common sources like wheat, barley, rye. Don't forget there's lots of wheat varieties, those ones on the screen that I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to. Also, so, some of the ingredients may be derived from wheat, barley, or rye. Like malt and soy sauce has or wheat, barley, or rye in it. And shocking to me, even some veggie burgers might have gluten if they contain something called seitan, which is derived from wheat gluten. So gluten is sneaky. It's a big deal when it's something that a student needs you to accommodate because of a disability. So you really got to dig in there and reach out. Don't just assume, and don't just leave this to your managers to try to figure out, right? This is something that really needs to be done at a district level to give them the tools they need. They need help with this. And here on list of screen is some ingredients that may contain gluten and definitely warrant further discussion with the manufacturer. So if you see these items listed in the ingredients of the product you're looking at, you really want to dig in and see if they are considered gluten items. There are some gluten-free grains that are creditable. So these are naturally gluten-free, the ones you see on the screen: rice, oats, corn, those different kinds of corn. But it's important to remember that even though a grain itself may be naturally gluten free, if it's been processed in a product, it very well could have some type of gluten in it, depending on the child's degree of sensitivity to gluten. So a lot you know from seeing in the grocery store now, a lot of items are labeled as gluten free. And that's helpful, but you really kind of again got to dig in there, and also don't be afraid to talk with a parent too. If a child really is gluten free because of a disability and the parent is working on gluten-free diet at the house, they might be a great source of information on the types of products they use or the things that they look for, ingredient labels. You can partner with them, right? Don't forget that they are a good resource. It's their child and they have a vested interest in protecting that child and would probably love to work with you on this. So there are some more gluten-free products on the screen, often made from gluten-free flours. You might see something called potato, starch or flour, straight soy, not soy sauce, tapioca, bean, nut flours. So it's not an all-inclusive list, but those are some gluten-free food products you might see. So when you're thinking about a gluten-free menu, what you want to do is when you can, you want to mirror your regular menu. So if the standard menu was a soft shell beef taco on a flour tortilla, you could do gluten-free by making homemade taco seasoning or maybe just serving plain meat with no gluten on a corn tortilla. If the regular menu is hamburger on a bun, you might be able to do a 100% beef burger with no fillers in it on a gluten-free bun. Chef salad with a roll, you might be able to do chef salad with a gluten-free muffin instead to meet the requirements. So you want to mirror the main menu when you can. All right, so let's practice. So, what do you do when a parent states their child is allergic to strawberries and wants you to prevent the child from eating strawberries or receiving strawberries? So, the first thing you need to think about as a supervisor is what is your internal process? So, I've used this several times throughout this presentation. This is something that could be done without a medical statement because you could just simply give the child a different fruit. They don't have to have strawberries, right? But if your internal policy says that all meal modifications are going to require a medical statement, then you would need a medical statement to accommodate this. And the medical statement would need to say something as simply as don't give the child strawberries, give them any other fruit. It could be that simple. So you receive a medical statement that says the child does not drink milk, provide juice at all meals. So this accommodation is outside the meal pattern, and therefore it does require a medical statement. So you need to look at your policy and you need to provide the accommodation. So let's just, in this case, you have all the information you need actually, because it says don't give them milk, provide juice. If the medical statement was written by a prescriptive authority that is allowed and you have everything you need, then you can make this accommodation and move on. If it didn't say provide juice, it says does not drink milk, you'd have to follow up, right? So in the meantime, you might provide the child the juice. Again, depending on what your internal procedure says, you might tell the parent, hey, our procedure says we'll accommodate this with juice for 2 weeks. and we need you to get the doctor to tell us to provide juice, right, while you're waiting. That's a possibility. You just got to follow what your procedure says. And that's why you need to do that develop that properly on the front end. So a parent requests their child be offered almond milk in place of cow's milk at meals. So what is your internal policy? This accommodation may or may not require a medical statement. It depends on your policy. If you allow milk substitutions without a medical statement, you have to ask yourself, like, first, have you told the state agency you're going to be implementing the waiver? Um, and then also, depending on what they've asked for, I know the previous slide said almond milk, but almond milk is probably never going to meet the requirement of a non-dairy beverage substitution. So you would have to have a medical statement to provide almond milk as opposed to just giving them a non-dairy beverage or a milk alternative that meets the requirements. So the big takeaway on this slide is that there is an alternate milk waiver. And so if you intend to provide an alternate milk without a medical statement, then you have to ask us for permission, and you can click on that link, and there is a form out there you will fill out and turn it in and tell us that you're going to do that as a district, basically. And then you could provide a non-dairy milk in place of cow's milk that meets the requirements of the regulations. You could do that without a medical statement. All right, so we're going to move on to a quick quiz. You're not going to answer these, on the slide or I mean, in the chat. You're just going to kind of think through these, and I'm going to give you just a moment, and then I'm going to give you the answer. So, true or false? Most physical and mental impairments constitute a disability in child nutrition programs. The answer is true. This includes bodily functions such as digestive, bowel, and endocrine systems. All right, next one, yes or no? You can delay a meal modification request if all the required documentation is not provided at the time of request. The answer is no, you're not going to delay the modification. You are going to provide as much as possible. Now, if it absolutely didn't give you anything, okay, yes, then you're going to delay it. But generally speaking, you're going to do the best you can with what you've got safely, and you're going to reach out immediately to the parent and let them know what you need specifically. And again, hopefully your procedure establishes a timeline so the parent kind of knows there's a deadline, the clock is ticking, but you're going to provide as much as you can safely for that period of time. So when is a medical statement required? So when a parent or guardian requests a vegetarian meal, if the meal pattern must be altered, when a teacher does not like the planned menu, if the student doesn't like milk. So which one of these scenarios would require a medical statement? The answer is B, if the meal pattern must be altered. You're not going to even consider the other things. What is not required to be included in a medical statement? So what is not required? Foods to be omitted and what to be substituted? Information related to the disability or impairment explaining why the accommodation is necessary, a signature from a parent, or an explanation of what must be done for the child. And the answer is a signature from the parent is not required. The other things are required elements of a medical statement. So which medical professional does not have prescriptive authority in the state of Tennessee? A medical doctor, a podiatrist, a dentist, or a veterinarian? And the answer is a veterinarian. You cannot accept a medical statement for a meal modification from a veterinarian for a child at your school. True or false? A reasonable accommodation is a policy or procedure used to accommodate a disability. That is false. A reasonable accommodation is a change or an alteration in policies, practices, or procedures to accommodate a child with a disability to make sure they have an equal opportunity. So, yes or no, you receive the following medical statement. It says, student cannot consume pineapple due to an allergic reaction. Please provide other fruit instead. Signed, Latasha Walker and her credentials. Is this documentation appropriate to provide a meal modification for the student? The answer is yes. The statement included the impairment, the food to be omitted, and what to provide, any other food. And it was signed by a medical professional with prescriptive authority. True or false? You can charge families a reasonable modification request since you are providing foods that are outside the meal pattern. No, false. A reasonable modification must be provided to the child at no extra cost. So you cannot charge families for the extra food you might have to go buy at the Walmart or your local grocery store. True or false? If you provide a food preference request, it must meet the USDA meal pattern. True. Remember, this is a food preference request. Examples of food preferences are general health concerns, personal preferences, vegetarianism, and religious and or moral convictions. So again, these are just preferences, and if you are going to accommodate them, they have to meet the USDA meal pattern. So where does gluten come from? Wheat, oatmeal, rye, or barley? Select all that apply. The answer is wheat, rye, and barley. So pure oatmeal does not contain gluten, but you may need to think about commercially processed oatmeal products, right? Just because an oatmeal product, if it's been processed, it could have gluten in it. So you, again, check those labels, reach out to the manufacturer. Which of the following may be hidden sources of gluten? Select all that apply. Hydrolyzed plant protein, whole grain oats, black beans, brown rice, or malt vinegar. So A, B, and E. So hidden sources of gluten could be hydrolyzed plant protein, whole grain oats could have hidden sources, and malt vinegar. So black beans and brown rice just generally do not contain gluten. But again, never hurts to check a label if it's something that's been processed. Which of the following is not a common food allergy? Eggs, milk, fish, strawberry, or sesame? The answer is strawberries. The other ones are common allergies. So remember, there are 9 common food allergies now. Strawberries is not one of the common ones, but a student could have a strawberry allergy. So just because it's not listed on the 9 common ones doesn't mean it's not possible. So the take-home message of this is to review your policies, procedures, and safeguards before you need them. Like, I know we're getting ready to wrap up a school year. We're kind of on the downhill slide. It is a great time as you move into the summer to look at your district's policy. What is your procedure for a parent submitting a meal modification request? It's a good time to build that team if your district doesn't have one and get that procedure in place so that parents know how to submit it in a way that is going to be effective. It's very frustrating when, a parent sends a note to the teacher and the teacher has the student run it down to the cafeteria cashier, and suddenly that day they want the child's accommodation to be made when you don't even have any idea it was even being requested, right? That if that's happening, that's an indication that a parent doesn't know the procedure, right? So your district needs to develop a procedure and get that out there to parents so they can really understand what's the right way to do this. And by the way, this is what's going to be required. And by the way, if you give us this information from a doctor, then we have to accommodate it legally. We can't just willy-nilly say, oh, well, we're not going to do it, or the parent can't just say you're not going to do it. You're going to request in writing that they ask for a stop of the accommodation if that's what they're going to do. But all of that takes work on the front end to get those procedures and safeguards in place for your district. And then you're going to work closely with parents. Once you've got your procedures and safeguards in place, when those modifications roll in, you need to work closely with the parents and other school personnel to meet those needs, to really make sure you're protecting those kids who need to be protected and getting those modifications made in a way that they feel safe and included in, just like the rest of the kids in the meal service. So, as always, reach out to me or your local consultant, your regional consultant. If you have questions, Lexi, I'm going to go ahead and put the survey up, and then I'm going to ask you if we have any questions in the chat.
That sounds good. We do have one for you.
Sure.
Okay, so the question is back on your example of providing juice instead of milk, did the medical statement state a medical reason for not drinking milk, or did it just say the child did not drink milk and that they have to provide juice instead?
So the medical statement would need to say, address how, um, why the child can't drink milk, like what major life function or issue is it causing. So I'm gonna, don't, let me not make everybody sick. I'm gonna go back several slides here real quick to the example that we have. Where is, I want to get the language right. So this right here, where it says request for meal modifications. Again, this is sample language, but this is basically what you need. So you'll notice on there it says describe the impairment and how it restricts the child's diet. So it would need to include more than just the child does not drink milk. It needs to say why does the child not drink milk? Um, what is the impairment behind that, and then what to do to accommodate it. That's a very good clarification on that example. It definitely needs to include these three items here that are on this sheet. Describe how the impairment describe the impairment, how it restricts the diet, what must be done to accommodate the child's diet, and then list the beverages or foods to be omitted and what to be substituted. So that's a great question. I'm just again try not to make anybody sick. Don't look. Oh no, I ended that. Sorry. I'm gonna
No
do.
worries if you can't pull
There
that
you go.
survey code up, Frankie. I put it in the chat for you, so everybody should
Oh,
be able to
good.
access that. Um,
Thanks.
And one more thing before we do wrap up, if you all wouldn't mind joining me in wishing our trainer, Miss Frankie, a happy birthday today. We truly
Thank you.
appreciate you spending your birthday afternoon educating us all on all things meal modifications. So we really appreciate you. And if anybody wants to wish her a happy birthday in the chat, please do so.
Thank you very much, Miss Lexi. I really appreciate that. It's, you know, yeah, it's great to be presenting on my birthday to be able to say hi to all of y'all. So
We
thanks a lot
surely
for that. I
appreciate
appreciate
you.
it.
And we appreciate everyone for joining us today. As we said before, all of these materials will be available in a follow-up email as well as on Teach All here shortly. But if you have any questions or anything else in the meantime, reach out to your consultant or one of us, and we'll be happy to help you. All right, everyone, have
Thanks
a
again,
great rest of your
everyone.
afternoon. Happy birthday, Frankie.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.